She was 19 years old and sleeping behind a feed store when the last of her welcome in Tanner's Crossing ran out. Cast off not by a stranger, but by her own mother's second husband, a hard, calculating man named Hollis Vance, who had waited only until her mother's funeral was over before telling her plainly that a stepdaughter with no blood claim to his name had no claim to his roof either. With $9.60 to her name, sewn into the hem of her only decent skirt, and a small canvas satchel holding nothing but a comb, a photograph, and her late father's discharge papers from the war, she wandered west along the rail line until she came to an auction notice tacked outside a land office in the Arizona Territory, advertising the sale of a decommissioned Army post, abandoned 2 years prior when the cavalry moved on and the government simply stopped paying to maintain it. She bought Fort Wardell, buildings and grounds entire, for $11, because it was the only thing in the territory cheap enough for a girl with nothing, and because the auctioneer laughed so hard at her bid that she felt, for the first time in months, a flicker of something like defiance rather than despair. It was, by any reasonable measure, a foolish and hopeless purchase. But sealed inside a locked trunk within the fort's old armory lay something that would not only give her back the name and dignity that had been stripped from her, but would set right a debt the United States Army itself had left unpaid for a decade. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Delphine Ashworth. If you have ever had your name taken from you by someone else's lie, tell us in the comments, because this story belongs to you as much as to her. Delphine Ashworth had been raised, for the first 11 years of her life, in the shadow of forts much like the one she would one day come to own, following her father, Sergeant Micah Ashworth, from one dusty posting to another across the Western Territories, a childhood spent among soldiers who treated her with the rough, affectionate courtesy of men far from their own daughters and wives. Micah Ashworth was a quartermaster by trade, a man responsible for the endless, unglamorous work of counting and safeguarding an army's supplies. And he raised his daughter with the particular values of a man who understood that armies were not won by valor alone, but by the tedious, unheralded discipline of records kept honestly and inventories that balanced to the last cartridge. He taught Delphine to read a ledger before she was 10 years old, sitting her beside him at his small field desk while he worked through columns of figures by lamplight, showing her how a single transposed number could mean the difference between a company fed and a company starved, and impressing upon her, again and again, that the keeping of an honest record was not clerk's work beneath a person's dignity, but a kind of quiet guardianship over other people's lives and trust. Her mother, Ruth, had married Micah Ashworth young and followed him without complaint through postings in Kansas, in the Dakota Territory, and finally in Arizona, teaching herself and then her daughter to sew, to preserve food against long winters, to make a home out of whatever bare quarters the Army assigned them, and to do it all with a warmth that never curdled into bitterness despite the hardship of that itinerant life. It was from her mother that Delphine learned patience, and from her father that she learned precision, and together those two virtues would prove, in later years, to be the very tools that saved her. When Delphine was 11, her father was killed in a skirmish along a supply route that history would remember, if it remembered it at all, as a minor engagement of no particular consequence, though it left an 11-year-old girl fatherless and a young widow with nothing but a modest pension and a trunk of her husband's careful ledgers, which Ruth kept, unable quite to part with the last physical evidence of the meticulous man he had been. Ruth Ashworth remarried 4 years later, in the town of Tanner's Crossing, to a cattleman named Hollis Vance, who owned a modest but respectable spread on the edge of town, and who courted Ruth with a persistence that Delphine, even at 15, found faintly unconvincing, though her mother, tired and lonely after years of widowhood, chose to believe in his affection rather than question it too closely. Hollis Vance was, from the very beginning, a man of two faces, warm and solicitous in company, cold and calculating when he believed no one of consequence was watching. And Delphine spent the 4 years of her mother's second marriage learning to read him the way her father had taught her to read a ledger, noting the small discrepancies between what he said and what he did. Though she said nothing of it, out of love for her mother and a young woman's uncertain hope that perhaps she was simply misjudging him. Ruth Ashworth died of consumption when Delphine was 19, coughing her last breath in a bedroom that had never quite felt like home. And it was at her mother's graveside, before the earth was even fully settled, that Hollis Vance informed his stepdaughter, in a voice carefully pitched low enough that none of the other mourners could overhear, that the house and the land had always been his alone, that she had no legal claim to either, and that she would do well to find other arrangements before the week was out. Delphine tried, in the days that followed, to appeal to whatever decency might remain in him, reminding him that her mother would have wanted her provided for, that she had nowhere else in the world to go, that she was willing to work for her keep in any capacity he named. Hollis Vance's response was to spread a quiet rumor through Tanner's Crossing, in the careful, deniable way of a man skilled at cruelty, without ever quite being caught at it, suggesting that his stepdaughter had grown troublesome and dishonest in her grief, that she had been caught taking money from the household accounts, a lie so baldly false that Delphine could not at first even understand why anyone would believe it, until she realized that Hollis Vance was a respected cattleman with land and standing, and she was only a grieving girl with no one left to vouch for her name. Doors that had once been friendly to her began closing, not out of any evidence against her, but out of the particular cowardice of small towns that would rather believe a comfortable lie from a powerful man than an inconvenient truth from a powerless girl. Within 2 weeks she had lost not only her home, but her reputation, the second theft feeling, in its way, crueler than the first, because a roof could be found again, but a name, once stained, followed a person like a shadow. She left Tanner's Crossing with what little she could carry, sleeping where she could, taking in mending and washing when anyone would trust her enough to pay her for it, and drifting, over the following months, further into the territory in search of some place where Hollis Vance's whispered lies had not yet traveled ahead of her. It was in this state, worn thin by months of uncertain shelter and uncertain meals, that she came to the dusty land office outside a modest settlement called Corvine Flats, where a notice pinned to the board advertised the government's disposal of a former military post, closed 2 years earlier when its garrison was reassigned and its buildings left to the mercy of sun and wind. Fort Wardell had been built a decade before to guard a stretch of territory long since pacified, and by the time Delphine saw the notice, the Army considered it worth nothing more than a fast sale to whoever would take the buildings off its hands and spare it the cost of demolition or upkeep. She attended the auction more out of desperate curiosity than any real intention to bid, standing at the back of a small crowd of local ranchers who had come mainly to see whether anyone would be foolish enough to take on the fort's crumbling adobe walls and leaking roofs. But something in her, some echo of the childhood she had spent among just such buildings, drew her forward when the bidding stalled embarrassingly low, and she found herself offering $11 for the whole of it before she had entirely decided to speak. The auctioneer, a wiry, sun-weathered man named Del Cranmer, laughed outright, remarking to the crowd that he supposed a girl ought to be allowed her joke. But when no other bid came forward, he accepted her money with a shrug and a bill of sale, telling her with something between pity and amusement that she'd bought herself $11 worth of headache and nothing more. Delphine walked the 1.5 miles out to Fort Wardell that same afternoon, her satchel over her shoulder and her father's discharge papers tucked against her chest as though they might somehow protect her, and stood at the edge of what had once been a functioning military post. Its parade ground gone to weeds, its barracks windows broken and staring like blind eyes, its flagpole standing bare against the pale desert sky. It was, by any sensible accounting, a ruin, and she was, by any sensible accounting, a girl with nothing. And yet, standing there in the fading light, she felt something she had not felt since her mother's death, a kind of stubborn, quiet resolve that this place, worthless as it appeared, was hers, entirely and legally hers, and that no one, not Hollis Vance, nor the town that had believed his lies, could take it from her the way they had taken everything else. She made her home, in those first weeks, in the old officers' quarters, the sturdiest of the fort's buildings, patching what she could with materials scavenged from the more thoroughly ruined structures, and supporting herself with mending work she carried into Corvine Flats twice a week, walking the distance without complaint, because complaint had never once solved anything in her experience. It was in her second month at the fort, clearing debris from the old Armory building in hopes of salvaging lumber she might sell or use for repairs, that she found, wedged into a recessed alcove behind a collapsed shelving unit, a small iron-banded trunk, padlocked and layered thick with dust, clearly overlooked by whatever quartermaster had been responsible for stripping the fort of its usable government property before its closure. The lock was rusted enough that a few determined strikes with a chisel from her father's old tool roll, one of the only possessions she'd managed to keep through all her recent troubles, broke it free, and she lifted the lid with the particular caution of someone who has learned not to expect good news from unexpected discoveries. Inside the trunk she found, first, a set of neatly bound ledgers, their leather covers worn, but their pages remarkably preserved by the trunk's tight seal against the desert's dry air, and beneath those, wrapped in oilcloth, a stack of official-looking correspondence bearing the letterhead of the Army Quartermaster's Department, along with a smaller, separate journal written in a hand she recognized with a jolt that stole the breath clean out of her chest, because it was, unmistakably, her own father's handwriting, the same careful, slanting script she had watched him use 1,000 times at his field desk when she was a girl. Fort Wardell, she realized with growing astonishment as she paged through the trunk's contents by the fading afternoon light, had been one of her father's final postings before his death. A fact she had never known because she had been too young at the time to be told the details of which forts he served at. And this trunk, sealed away and forgotten in the Armory for over a decade, held the last records he had ever kept. What Delphine read in her father's final journal, over the following days spent poring over every page by lamplight with a devotion bordering on reverence, was a story far larger and stranger than she could have imagined. Micah Ashworth, in the months before his death, had uncovered evidence of a substantial fraud being carried out against the Quartermaster's Department, in which shipments of Army supplies, particularly cattle and horses requisitioned from local ranchers at fair government rates, were being falsely recorded as delivered and paid for in full, while in truth a portion of each shipment was being diverted and sold privately by a civilian contractor working in league with a junior officer at the fort, the two of them pocketing the difference between what the ranchers were actually paid and what the government believed had been dispersed. Her father's journal, written in increasingly careful and deliberate detail as though he understood the danger of what he had discovered, named the civilian contractor responsible as a young cattle broker operating out of Tanner's Crossing, a man identified in the ledgers by a name that made Delphine's hands go cold as she read it: Hollis Vance. The pieces fell together with a clarity that left her sitting motionless on the floor of the old Armory for a long while, the journal open in her lap, the desert wind sighing through the broken windows around her. Hollis Vance, then a younger man just beginning to build the fortune and respectability that would one day let him cast out his own stepdaughter without a second thought, had defrauded the very ranchers of the region, many of them struggling families supplying cattle to the fort at prices meant to sustain them through hard seasons, and had done so with the complicity of an officer inside Fort Wardell itself. Her father, discovering the scheme through his meticulous cross-checking of delivery records against payment ledgers, had begun compiling evidence to bring the matter before the fort's commanding officer. And Delphine understood now, reading his final entries, dated mere days before the skirmish that took his life, that his death, always described to her as an unfortunate accident of a minor engagement, might not have been so simple or so accidental as she had spent her whole life believing. The journal did not accuse anyone outright of murder, for her father had been too careful a man to make claims he could not prove. But it recorded, in his final entry, his intention to ride out the following week, to deliver his findings personally to the department inspector, rather than trust them to the mail, out of what he called, in his own cautious words, an abundance of caution regarding certain parties who might not wish this matter to come to light. He never made that ride. He died instead in a skirmish along the very supply route he would have traveled, in circumstances that had never been closely examined, because a quartermaster's death in hostile territory raised no particular questions at the time. Delphine sat with that possibility for a long, difficult night, understanding that she could never prove with certainty what had truly happened on that road, but understanding equally that the evidence in her hands, the same evidence her father had died carrying the knowledge of, could still finish the work he had begun, could still bring to light the fraud that Hollis Vance had built his fortune upon, and could still return to the ranching families of the region the money that had been stolen from them under the government's own unwitting seal. She spent the following weeks working through her father's ledgers with the same painstaking care he had once taught her, cross-referencing his figures against the fort's own surviving supply records, most of which had been left behind uncollected in the chaos of the post's closure, and now sat gathering dust in the old quartermaster's office, forgotten by an army too preoccupied with newer postings to bother retrieving paperwork from a fort it considered worthless. What she assembled over those careful weeks was an unbroken chain of evidence, her father's original notes on the discrepancies, corroborating supply manifests showing shipments recorded as full that local ranchers' own memories and, in several cases, their own surviving handwritten receipts confirmed had been delivered short, and correspondence between the junior officer and Hollis Vance's cattle brokerage that, while carefully worded, left little room for innocent interpretation once laid alongside the rest. Word reached Hollis Vance, as word in a small territory inevitably does, that the girl he had cast out of Tanner's Crossing was living at the old fort and asking careful questions among the ranching families he had once cheated. And he came to Fort Wardell himself on a hot, still morning, arriving in a fine buggy that looked absurdly out of place amid the ruined barracks, wearing the same warm, respectable smile he had always used to disguise the coldness beneath it. He offered her money at first, calling it charity for a stepdaughter fallen on hard times, a sum that would have solved every practical hardship she faced, and when she declined it, he shifted, with the smoothness of long practice, into threats disguised as concern, reminding her that a girl already believed dishonest by an entire town would find no one willing to credit whatever wild stories she might invent about a man of his standing, and suggesting, in a voice gone quiet and hard beneath its surface warmth, that pursuing this matter further would only confirm to Tanner's Crossing what everyone already believed about her character. Delphine had spent years learning to read the gap between what Hollis Vance said and what was true, and she heard, beneath his threats, the unmistakable fear of a man who understood exactly how much he stood to lose. She told him plainly, with a steadiness she had not entirely expected to find in herself, that she did not intend to rely on stories at all, but on her father's own ledgers, on the fort's surviving supply records, and on the sworn recollections of the ranching families he had cheated, all of which she intended to place before the regional army inspector and the territorial land office, both of whom had jurisdiction enough to take the matter seriously, regardless of what Tanner's Crossing chose to believe about her. Vance left the fort that day without his smile, and Delphine understood that whatever came next would not come easily, because a man who had already proven willing to ruin a grieving girl's reputation over a matter of inheritance would not hesitate to fight far harder to protect a fraud that had built the whole of his fortune. In the weeks that followed, Vance used every advantage his years of accumulated respectability afforded him, spreading word through Tanner's Crossing and Corvin Flats alike that the Ashworth girl, already known to be dishonest, had now taken to inventing elaborate conspiracies involving dead soldiers and stolen government cattle in a desperate bid for attention or money. And for a time it seemed his version of events might simply drown out hers before she ever reached anyone with the authority to investigate properly. But Delphine had one advantage Vance had not accounted for, which was that the ranching families he had cheated a decade earlier had never forgotten the strange shortfalls in their government payments. Families who had quietly absorbed the loss at the time because they lacked the standing to challenge an army contractor's word, and who now, faced with a young woman offering not accusation, but documented proof matching their own long-buried suspicions, began coming forward one by one to add their own recollections and surviving receipts to what Delphine had already assembled. Among them was an aging rancher named Emebr, who had kept, out of stubborn habit rather than any particular foresight, a handwritten tally of every head of cattle he had ever delivered to Fort Wardell, a tally that matched Micah Ashworth's ledgers almost to the animal, and whose willingness to testify openly gave the others the courage to do the same. With Emebr and 4 other ranching families willing to stand behind her, Delphine traveled to the territorial capital and requested, with a formality her father would have been proud of, a hearing before the regional army inspector responsible for auditing old quartermaster accounts, presenting her father's ledgers, the fort's surviving records, and the corroborating testimony of the ranchers in a case laid out with such careful, methodical precision that the inspector, a weary but thorough man named Colonel Aldous Fenn, found himself unable to dismiss it as the fanciful invention Vance had claimed it to be. The investigation that followed took the better part of a year, moving with the deliberate slowness of any official inquiry. But it moved forward nonetheless, uncovering additional records from the department's own archives that confirmed the pattern of falsified deliveries during precisely the period Micah Ashworth's journal described, and eventually implicating not only Hollis Vance, but the long-vanished junior officer who had colluded with him, a man who had since died of natural causes, but whose complicity was confirmed beyond reasonable doubt by the paper trail the 2 men had left behind. The reckoning, when it finally came, was not the dramatic public unmasking Delphine might once have imagined in her angrier moments, but something quieter and, in its way, more thorough. The Army's formal findings were entered into official record, restoring on paper what had been falsely recorded for a decade, and confirming that Sergeant Micah Ashworth had died in the honest performance of his duty, having uncovered and begun documenting a genuine fraud against the government he served, a finding that came with a formal letter of commendation delivered to Delphine as his only surviving heir, along with a modest but meaningful settlement in recognition of her father's service. Hollis Vance faced civil judgment, requiring him to repay the defrauded ranchers, with interest calculated across the intervening decade, a sum substantial enough to consume the greater part of the fortune he had built his respectability upon. And though he was never imprisoned, for the fraud predated statutes that might have allowed criminal charges to stick after so many years. He found himself, much like men of his kind so often do, punished most severely, not by any court, but by the collapse of the very reputation he had spent his life so carefully constructing. As Tanner's Crossing, learning at last the truth of both the theft and the lie he had told about his stepdaughter, turned from him with the same swift, uncomfortable cowardice it had once shown her. It is worth remembering, when we think of Delphine Ashworth, that she began this story as a homeless 19-year-old girl, her name stained by a lie, sleeping behind a feed store with nothing to her own but a comb, a photograph, and her father's discharge papers, and that she bought a crumbling, abandoned fort for $11, not because she saw treasure in it, but because it was the only door left open to her in the entire territory. She could not have known, standing in that dusty auction crowd, that the very buildings everyone else considered worthless held within them her father's final, unfinished act of honesty, waiting a decade to be carried the rest of the way home by the daughter he had taught, without either of them knowing why it would one day matter so much, to read a ledger the way other people read a person's character. In finishing her father's work, Delphine did not merely restore her own name. She restored his, and she restored to a handful of struggling ranching families a portion of what had quietly been taken from them years before, proving that a debt, however long buried, does not simply disappear with time, and that the truth, however patiently it must wait, has its own way of finding the hand strong enough to finally carry it forward. Thank you for sitting with us through Delphine Ashworth's story today. If her patience and her father's quiet integrity moved you, we would be grateful if you shared this with someone who has ever had their good name taken from them unjustly. Before you go, we would love to know, what is a moment in your own life when you found real worth in something, or someone, that everyone else had already dismissed as finished? Leave it for us in the comments below. We read every single one. Until next time, stay close.